Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here, and I am looking forward to talking about this today, but I asked for some topics on one of my recent videos to discuss on this channel, and I got a comment that said that they wanted me to talk about why Italian Americans consider themselves Italian and what they mean by Italian. And honestly, at first I was thinking, okay, do I really want to talk about this anymore? Because I've talked about it in other videos and it's such a huge point of contention online. So I wasn't sure that I was completely up for rediscussing it. But it does raise some interesting questions, I think, about maybe some misunderstandings, possible misunderstandings between motherland Italians and those of Italian origin that live in the diaspora, particularly in the United States. So first and foremost, this video is not claiming that Italian Americans are the same as Italians living in Italy. I'm just explaining why Italian Americans continue to identify as Italian, in some cases many generations later, and kind of where this disagreement happens, my perspective on this. I'm also going to be giving you some interesting data. There were some polls and all of that. I'm going to link everything in the description box, so you'll have access to everything that I sourced in order to come up with the concepts that I'll mention in this video. Much of the disagreement on this topic, I think, comes from different understandings of what certain terms mean, like nationality versus ancestry, or maybe even lived culture versus inherited culture. So rather than approaching this emotionally or defensively, I'm going to provide first some historical context, okay? Some polling data, which I found fascinating to look at, and also just kind of recurring patterns, things that people have told me, my own personal experience, and bring all of these things full circle to give us a better understanding of the Italian American identity, why people consider themselves Italian or Italian American, and why this is something that has persisted for so long. So in terms of historical background, what I will say is that Italian mass migration, as I've mentioned before, occurred primarily between the 19th and 20th centuries, largely from southern Italy. So many of you that are people of Italian origin living in the diaspora, your family likely came from the south, just in case you didn't know that. But when they arrived in the United States, and I can't speak for other communities in the diaspora, but specifically when they arrived in the United States, they were not considered fully white. Now, dare I mention this point again, because last time I nearly got burned at the stake for mentioning this, but I'm saying this more from like a cultural and social perspective, not necessarily what was on paper. Okay, basically anybody that wasn't a WASP at that time, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, was considered not quite white. So that is something important to keep in mind. Okay, just put a little asterisk there. Okay, relax. In addition to that, okay, there was a ton of stereotyping, like in terms of criminality, poverty, literacy, all of that. Okay, some of it was maybe accurate, some of it wasn't, some of it was certainly constructed ideas in order to keep this population in their place. So that did create a certain perspective about the Italian American community that was now living within the United States, okay? And these communities were also segregated residentially and also occupationally, so that just kind of created a community that's very insular, I guess, okay? Basically, they stayed together and they continued a lot of the traditions, they spoke their languages together, this continued sort of what we see in terms of like tight-knit Italian American communities. As Italians started to integrate into society a little bit more, especially in terms of their work performance, because it was well known that Italians were willing to do very difficult jobs, and there's actually a lot of really interesting history about that I haven't gotten into, like common occupations that they did during that period of time. It's something that I'll have to address in another video, but that kind of integration happened a little bit faster. Where there was a delay was certainly with the language aspect, okay? This is something that happened over the course of several generations, and I will say, as I've mentioned before, and I made it's actually one of my personal favorite videos on this topic is about why Italian Americans don't speak Italian anymore. I'm going to link that video in the description box because it's my personal favorite video. Anytime I can tie this topic with linguistics, it's always going to be one of my favorites. But there's a really interesting reason why I think a lot of Italian Americans lost contact with their language, and just an interesting thing to think about. But that certainly played a role in their integration versus, let's say, Irish Americans that already spoke English. They may have better integrated linguistically, let's say. Cultural practices, family structures, community networks remained intact, and this kind of contributed to the insular nature of the Italian American community, but particularly religion and an adherence to the Catholic faith was really important because this maintained a lot of the traditions of getting baptized, first communions, and so on. That was a huge part of maintaining a lot of the traditions that we still see in Italian American communities today. Italian kind of became like a shared marker of origin. And again, this was partially due to the fact that they weren't considered fully integrated into American society in the same ways that maybe other groups were. But I mean, this isn't exclusive to the Italian American community. This was common in lots of groups. It's just, I think that there are a combination of factors that kept the Italian American community additionally isolated for longer periods of time than maybe other communities, okay? But this shift away from identifying as Italian kind of started to happen around World War II. Once the U.S. got involved in World War II, Italians were labeled as alien enemies. And so, this was a big push to fully integrate and start speaking English, become American, and so on. So that's the historical side. Let's get into kind of present day Italian American attitudes about their identity as Italians, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Of course, the statistics I'm going to share are specific to the Italian American community. I can't speak for Italian communities in other diasporas. So if you come from another place, like maybe you're, in Australia of Italian origin or Argentina of Italian origin, I would love to hear your perspective on this because it's very, very interesting to compare diasporas. But I pulled some polling data, and I'll link all of this in the description so you can see and check it out for yourself. But basically, it shows that a majority of Americans with Italian ancestry still self-identify as Italian or Italian American, okay? That's significant. Now, roughly half, 49% to be exact, describe this heritage as important or integral to their identity, okay? So, those are significant numbers. And I think that this definitely contributes to how they see themselves within their own social circles. A much smaller number, however, engage with Italian identity daily. And that's something important to keep in mind. I would say that many, many Italian Americans are quite disconnected from what goes on in Italy. So I think that this suggests a couple different things. It's interesting to think about. So it suggests, firstly, that there is an awareness of the difference between ancestry and nationality, but also that this is an identity that is symbolic and meaningful to this group of people rather than just total and immersive in a way. So I think that that's kind of something to keep in mind as well, okay? And the way that people identify themselves, I think, is very personal. That's something that we have to keep in mind. The Italian American community is not necessarily one thing, okay? It's not a hive mind and that everybody thinks alike. I think that there are some shared interests or ideas, certainly traditions and so on. But I think that if you were to poll people individually, their answers would vary a lot. And I think that Italian American identity today is most strongly associated with those shared traditions that they have, family traditions. Certainly food is a huge thing, this is something I've talked about before, but one of the reasons why I was so connected, I think, for essentially my whole childhood growing up and so on was because we ate Italian American food in my house, okay? That's the food that I was raised on. And I think that food plays a huge role in your identity. Now, of course, Italians The motherland Italians would say that that food is not really Italian. I would also tend to agree. It's a different category, okay? I'm not going to disagree with that. I've lived in Italy. I know what the food is like in Italy. It is different from Italian American food. I'm not saying that they're the same thing, but what I will say is that these traditions shape a person's identity, and they shape a person's experience of the world around them. And so, we have to account for that. But, also just conversations with family members and talking about ancestors, talking about traditions, talking about what used to go on in the old country. That was a thing that my grandparents used to share all the time, is like, family stories and these sort of like intergenerational narratives that I think form who you are as a person, and if you're a person like me who was very interested in this, I used to drill my grandparents all the time. Like literally every time I would see them, I would ask them other questions, tell me about this, tell me about that. Who was this person? Who was the patriarch? Like all of this information was really important to me. So all that to say that I think that a lot of these values are values that are created within the family and also reinforced in the community. So again, for those of you that are part of, let's say, Italian communities or the Italian diaspora in other countries, I would be really interested to know about your experiences, because what has happened in the Italian American community in the U.S., I think might be quite different. And I can just speak from experience what I actually observed when I was in Argentina. The way that Italianness is expressed in Argentina, I think, is very different from what it looks like in the United States. That's a topic for another video that would probably be very interesting. But please do comment below and give me your feedback, kind of what your experience was, what it is to you, what it's like growing up in an Italian American community in Australia or Canada or Brazil or wherever, okay? I do know, however, that Italian communities in other countries are quite strong. So this suggests that the Italian identity is not uniquely US American Italians, right? Like this is part of a larger, broader Italian experience and Italian context, shaped mostly by migration, history, and the host country. Whatever was going on contextually in that host country is going to shape that community. And again, we can see this in places like Brazil and Argentina, which I'll get into in another video. So a bit of a personal observation, and this is just basically through conversations that I've had with other Italian Americans. I do recognize that the Italy that exists today did not exist when many of our ancestors moved and settled in other countries. Okay. So I see these communities, specifically the Italian American community, as kind of like a time capsule from another era. Okay. I think that there are a lot of similarities and certainly tendencies, traditions, and so on that we can see in common, but I do recognize that we're quite different. And I suppose that this is part of the contention that many motherland Italians have with Italian Americans, is that they just don't think that we have that much in common, which I do tend to agree with more often than not. I've lived in both places, so I can see that, and I can really vouch for that. It is quite different. These are very different community. Again, there are shared things, shared concepts, shared traditions, even in some cases words, language, and so on. But I do think that we're very different in many ways. At the same time, I can understand why many Italian Americans want to reconnect with their roots, because Italian Americans in many ways have very different traditions from Americans in other cultural contexts, okay? And I think that there's a genuine interest to connect with those traditions, and that, to me, is something that's really beautiful and should be encouraged. But, and this is the one thing that I will say about specifically the Italian American community, I do think that there's cultural literacy that's lacking a lot, okay? And a lot of Italian Americans are very disconnected from what is modern day Italy in terms of language, culture, politics, all of that, okay? So my advice to Italian Americans is to develop more cultural literacy, whether that's going out and learning the language, going to visit your town of origin. If you have the means to be able to do that, I think that that's wonderful. Really huge way to reconnect. I think everyone should be able to do that at some point, ideally. Keeping up with Italian current events, I think, is important. Learning about the history and so on. Subscribing to channels like mine, I think, is also a nice step in the right direction. That was a shameless plug, but I just have to say it. I know that there's a lot of genuine interest, and this is why I have subscribers to this channel. That's why a lot of you watch my videos, because you're interested, and I want to encourage that. I am a teacher. I'm a linguist. I'm somebody that loves to encourage people to continue learning, okay? And it's been part of my own personal journey. It's why I enjoy sharing it on this channel. So I just want to continue encouraging you to do that on your own terms, because I do think it's an important way for people to reconnect and connect deeper with traditions that you may already have. So to sort of recap, okay, identity in the US for a long time was ancestry based, and still kind of culturally and socially continues to be so. So I think that that's one of the main drivers here, okay? But that history also we have to keep in mind, because it socially excluded these people for a long time, which created much deeper, stronger communities. And that explains why they sort of continued their insular traditions, okay? The family, religion, communities, all of these formal and informal institutions sort of reinforce these ideas across multiple generations. This identity is not the equivalent of being Italian today. I do recognize that. I think most Italian Americans recognize that. Most of us are aware that we have different traditions, different food, many different things, okay? But at the same time, it also doesn't negate the Italian American identity as well, okay? That's sort of a separate, let's say, subgroup or subculture that does exist, okay? And the fact that we can observe this, we can see the trends, and we can see the responses in the polling data, I think further establishes that. Now, again, I do see that these are very different communities, and as I already said earlier on, this presents very differently in different diasporas. Each diaspora has its own experiences, has its own community. So that's also something that's important to keep in mind. But thank you so much for being here, for watching this video, for continuing to support this channel. I really appreciate it. So continue to like, share, comment, subscribe, all the things. It really does help me out, and it helps out this channel. It helps get this information out to more people as well, and ideally to encourage people to continue connecting to their roots, which is something that I find important. So thanks again. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.